Welcome to Wagon Wheel. I'm Jarrod Kimber, and I'm here to answer your questions. Well, if you've asked any, or I suppose answer someone else's questions if you haven't. Shall we start with our Patreon questions? A lot to get through today, so let us hit the track running. Take an early wicket, score off the first ball, however you want to. Whatever analogy that you have coming to mind. With Patreon people, remember, if you want to guarantee a question every week, you can either do it via Patreon, where you contact us. I think it's on the first class plan and above, and you can do that. And the other way is obviously via Super Chats. And if you can listen to this podcast on the podcast platform, or on YouTube, or on Twitter, or on Facebook. I feel like I'm everywhere all at once. Surf says, looking at Elgar's 4+ dismissals caught behind on the leg side versus Australia, is that a new thing for him, or has there been a similar pattern before? I got the feeling that started against England, and I can't remember because India, I don't remember India trying it. But my memory is that there was a time when England were looking at it as well. I don't know if they had as much success as Australia with it, but I do feel that Elgar has done that. So, that's one of the things with advanced analytics that we can do now. We know that there are certain players who struggle to get out of the way of balls, and that I suppose their gloves maybe, but also the way that they play down the leg side. It's not that hard if you're an analyst to see that as a recurring pattern. Even if someone's not being dismissed on it a few times, I think it's certainly something that you could see. So we might see going ahead more and more situations where teams try strategies like that against certain batters, just because, especially in the case of Elgar, we're talking about someone who, I'm trying to think of how many balls he would have faced in Test cricket. It's a lot. He would have faced a lot. 10,000 balls, probably more than that now, in Test cricket. And so we have so much data on him that you might see plans like that. But yeah, my memory was that England was the first ones to have a go at that. And I get the feeling he went out once. Probably England or South African fans might remember a little bit better than me. But that was the first time I went, that's interesting. Rather than maybe occasionally seeing teams go at his body, not thinking that it was a specific plan beforehand. Varun says, how do you rate Australia's chances of winning the Border Gavaskar Trophy? Low. Seems like Pat Cummins has the personnel to conquer the final frontier this year, assuming the pitches are prepared sportingly. Well, I wouldn't expect they would be prepared sportingly. I don't know why you would play against Australia if you were India and allow them to have seam bowling friendly pitches or even flat pitches. You'd probably want to test them out against spin, especially with some left-handers there. That said, I don't see Australia as being quite good enough to win consistently against India. I suppose the big question mark is India's batting at home. Generally, they've been good enough against most of the teams. I certainly think Australia can win a test. I don't know if they're prepared as well as they did in 2016, but I think they're a better team than they were in 2016. They still don't really have a secondary spinner that is going to bother India at all. Cameron Green is the one variable that I'm interested about. I'm not expecting him to take a lot of wickets, but he does allow Australia to, change up their lineups. The one thing I would say about that is that would have worked a lot better if they had a secondary spinner who they were absolutely positive about. So they've got Agar, Todd Murphy, and Swepson. So Todd Murphy probably doesn't bowl unless Lyon gets injured, I would assume. Or unless they think he's incredible. He's very, very, very young, of course, very, very new. Agar will be okay, but, he's not as good as Jack Leach, for instance. He's not as good as Keshav Maharaj. So I'm not expecting, anything special from that perspective. Swepson is more interesting, but I do think if we look at the history of, slower leg spinners in India, they don't put as much pressure on. I think you need to be a little bit quicker through the air in India if you're going to be a wrist spinner, just because of the way that the pitches handle spin. So again, I'm not expecting any of those to make a big damage. So it really does come down to the seamers. That would seem to be an easier thing to nullify if the Indians want to do it. But I also just think that, Ashwin versus the left hand is also a big problem for Australia. I think Australia versus high quality spin. When was the last time Australia played high quality spin in Asia? trying to think back to when they were in the UAE against West Indies, against Pakistan. So I think it's very tough for them to say that they're suddenly going to win that series. But, they should be in it. They're a good team. Oh, sorry, Renee. Renee says, when will we see Sachin Tendulkar-like career again? Someone who gets into a top international team at 16 years old. Will any team take a risk of getting someone so young, or will never happen again? I wouldn't say it will never happen again. I think the chances are now, and this is not taking anything away from Sachin, because in his era it made sense. I really wonder what would have happened if you had a player now as talented as him, and we haven't seen anyone come in, so it's a bit tricky, or certainly no one that instantly springs to my mind. But if we saw someone as talented as him start as early as he did, with the fact that we have video and analysis and everything else, because we have seen with very, very good players, certainly not on Sachin's level, but with very, very good players, it took about an innings of Matt Renshaw to realize what the problems were with Matt Renshaw. And I still think Matt Renshaw should come back a better player. And I do wonder if that is, the same with someone like Zach Crawley, Hamid. I'm trying to think of some of the other really, really young players who have played around the world. And I think from that perspective, it might be tougher now. As someone who watches a lot of basketball, you watch the rookies come in basketball, and you can see that they're going to be good in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, and that they're already maybe productive players. But you can also see now how easy it is to exploit them in different ways, because they're, okay, well, he can't do this, so we'll just run this move against him. Whereas before we had proper video analysis or data analysis, that was really hard to find out. And you may not scheme for, the young player in the same way. You just try and put pressure on them emotionally, through sledging or through high quality cricket. And we know that someone like Sachin wouldn't have a problem with that, but would he have had a problem with something else? Now, he didn't have as many technical issues. Having said that, it would be interesting to see early on if he did, and he had to develop the way that most players do. Players usually become a little bit more rounded, if especially on his level. So from that perspective, I don't know. I would be shocked if no one tried it again, whether we'll ever see anyone be successful. And then it comes down to the fact they'll just have to be as good a player as him. I mean, Steve Smith was not successful when he first came into the team. My memory of Kane Williamson was his batting average took a while to develop. I might be wrong there as well. Alistair Cook started very well, then had regression, and then got better again. It's really hard when you're young, starting in Test cricket. One of the more interesting things is a lot of players don't play a lot of 3 and 4 day cricket before, if you're like Sachin, you're not playing a lot of 3 and 4 day cricket now if you're coming through. So it's even harder, I would have thought. You would almost dumping them into the game. Will says, is the list of best batting orders, in the list of best batting orders, where would you rank the Flower era England? Cook, Strauss, Trott, Peterson, Bell, Collingwood, Pryor. It was very good at its peak. Strauss is an above average Test opener, but he's certainly not one of the best Test openers of all time. Trott, very, very good in that, great in that small window. I'm trying to think how long it was. Was it 2019 to 20? It's not a long period again. Peterson, outstanding. I think if you also factor in the effect that he had on opposition teams, Bell probably not quite as good as Peterson. Collingwood, again, I would have thought is, probably more on that Strauss level. And Pryor was certainly above average. So it's very, very good. I don't think it, I'm probably, hopefully none of the people I know on this list are watching at the moment. I could just imagine Andrew Strauss, asking his friends to get my number to send me a very ordinary thing. But I do know a couple of those players, obviously. I don't think it's one of the all-time list, but I think it's a very deep. If let's say Collingwood or Strauss is the worst batter there, that's a very, very solid, longer list. I think I can't remember the question the other day, might have been about top 4s or top 5s. This goes a little bit deeper than that. I don't think it compares to, the Australian teams that go bat to number 7, for instance, or perhaps some of the South African teams that bat to number 7, some of the early 1950s England teams who probably had, or maybe they didn't have as strong a player at number 7. Uh, Also, one other question I would be very interested there is how often that particular six played together. It doesn't feel like it was that often. James says people often credit the courage of the helmet era batters who don't wear them. Example: Viv Richards, Richie Richardson. Do you think that is justified, or the fact that those batters opted not to wear helmets, even though they're available, indicate that those batters weren't really conceding an advantage? Yeah, I don't credit the courage of those players because as someone, so I grew up slightly after that era, and when I grew up in Australian cricket, I think the rule in junior cricket in Victoria at that time, or for most leagues, seemed to be that you should start with a helmet, but you didn't have to continue with a helmet. And I would get the helmet off as quickly as possible and then go on to bat. And as I became an adult, I didn't wear a helmet at all. Very, very rarely. I didn't see myself as more courageous than the people at the other end without a helmet. My thing was that I just felt that because I didn't wear it all the time between the age of 8 and 16, and I probably, especially when I was batting longer innings, I was batting without a helmet. I just felt that I could see the ball slightly better without a helmet, and I felt more comfortable without a helmet. I'd never been hit in the head either, which maybe would have changed things if I'd been hit in the head at a young age. And so I never thought to myself, "Oh, I'm courageous," and the other players aren't. I just thought that I was a player who liked not having one, and the other players were players who felt more comfortable with it on. The whole Viv Richards was so brave because he didn't wear a helmet. Yes, because I suppose he certainly got to a certain part of his career where he could have put a helmet on. My guess is he wouldn't have felt comfortable with it on. I think he would have felt a little bit constricted with it on. And I'm just basing that on players of my sort of age group who wore a helmet 50% of the time. There were some players who thought it was a statement not to wear a helmet. But there are a lot of other players who just said, I can see the ball when I'm not wearing a helmet. So I'm not in a situation where I'm thinking to myself that was the case. I think the interesting one is Richie Richardson, and that because he does move to a helmet. And my guess is that he moved to a helmet at a point where he just wasn't seeing the ball well enough. And he maybe was getting rattled occasionally with the short ball. And I think with Viv Richards, he had built up a brand as, one of the last players not to go to a helmet, that it would have been a bit awkward for him at that, even later on. And he probably should have worn a helmet in the last couple of years. You hear about the Duncan Spencer spell and things like that. I'm not saying Duncan Spencer wouldn't have roughed him up earlier in his career, but I think Viv would have handled it a little bit better. But yeah, and also a lot of it is about bravado, isn't it? And everything else. Viv Richards, for those who don't know his full career, was a lot of what he did was performative. And I don't mean that in a bad way at all. In the same way that Shane Warne was performative. I'm trying to think of someone else, those sorts of players where they are trying to beat you before they perform the act. And I think Viv Richards was very much part of that. And I think that was also very much a part of that West Indies cricket culture, and that disappears. He's not the only one, but the last player that I remember regularly facing medium fast bowlers without a helmet was Ricky Ponting. And if you look at it, he probably, I'm not sure what his age is, but he's probably a couple of years older than me. He probably would have come from a similar era to me where he played with it and then he took it off and then he didn't play with it and maybe got more confident, and then when there was a fast bowler, maybe he'd bring it back on, or a second new ball, or whatever that may be. And I, again, don't remember thinking, oh, Ricky Ponting's so brave. I remember thinking Ricky Ponting probably just feels more comfortable without it on, but more often than not, he wears it because, the guys are bowling 80, 85 miles an hour at him. The last professional players, just as an aside, James, that I know of, and I'm using professional lightly, but they play international cricket, is the Bermudan team. They have a couple of brothers, I think, or maybe cousins, who don't wear the helmet, and a couple of other players who also don't wear the helmet. And I chatted to some of them about it, one day at the hotel. And again, they said a very similar thing. When they grew up playing cricket, they didn't always have access to helmets. And when we played against them and I did the due diligence, they were the players I told not to, I told our players to bounce, because I think they had grown up facing bowlers at 70, 75 miles an hour. And, even the Scottish bowlers, who are just that little bit quicker and sometimes taller, they caused them real problems with their short ball. In fact, to the point that, before each game, we sort of, especially with certain bowlers like Ali Evans, I would give a list of who you should bowl short to and who you shouldn't, who should try your bouncer with and who you shouldn't try your bouncer with. And he got confused because, there were so many players with similar names and brothers and cousins and everything else. And I said, it's really simple. If you're playing against a Bermudan player and they have a helmet on, don't bounce them. And if they don't have a helmet on, do bounce them. So that sort of goes against, again, that, the courageous thing. It goes back to how you feel comfortable. I can't remember the last time I batted with a helmet on. It would be a very, in England, because I grew up in Australia, the ball gets above your shoulder a lot more. In England, I just can't remember the last time I did it. I would assume I'd feel very uncomfortable now if I went out and had to bat with a helmet. And if you've ever, for people who lived in one era or the other, it's a slightly different one. But I think for people like me who grew up with it a little bit and without it a little bit, you probably pick your favorites more. There you go. Helmet talk. I love this podcast. Will says, is it just me or is the Root Silverwood regime's performance in Australia worthy of some reevaluation? England arguably did better in Australia than any team has done since, which suggests a lot to do with the Australian side just being really good. I don't know if it needs reevaluation. I mean, if you follow this stuff, Will, you know that I don't tend to overreact or underreact to captains and coaching errors. Occasionally you do see what's happened with Brendan McCullum, but more often than not, the same things happened. It just maybe you have your fit players available more often, or you have an easier schedule or a harder schedule and you have injuries, whatever that may be. There's no doubt to say that England cricket has changed their thinking. I think it's crisper. I think they have better role definition before. And also they are making the most of their strengths while trying to cover. There's still a lot of weaknesses there. So from that perspective, very little of that was being done under the Silverwood era. I think I've said before that, I thought Anderson and Broad bowled really well, and Scott Boland took more wickets than the two of them combined, or one less than the two of them combined. And I'm a huge Scott Boland fan, but let's be real here. There was certainly an age, a part of the procession. The one thing I would say about longer tours, having talked to a lot of players from, 1950s all the way through to modern time, there are tours that just slide early, and there's nothing you can do to pull them back. I would say that was more of the case against a very good team who's very good at home. But England had been very poor for a long time. If you want to reevaluate that one tour, that's fine. I mean, I think you've probably seen some of my pieces on their batting. I started talking about their batting in 2013? Maybe 20. I started talking about England's batting on the slide in 2012, in fact. So for me, it was a long time coming to, change that up. I certainly wouldn't worry too much about one series. Bloody Bugger says, your choice of format of role. Which players' legacy is hurt the most by the fact that they never played against their own teammates? Oh, potential example. You recently mentioned Desmond Haynes as an ODI GOAT with Borough, but the best bowling attack at that time was the West Indies. Yes, that was. I suppose you could put... Oh. Trying to think specifically of someone that would have been that case. I think Desmond Haynes was a pretty good player of pace bowling, though. So I'm trying to think if it would be someone else. So what you would really want is Darren Lehman might be an interesting one to go back and have a look at. A player who was probably at his best against the England nibbling ball and spin bowling. How would he have gone against sort of, Lee, Fleming, McGrath, Gillespie era Australia, where maybe only Fleming is the only version. And even then, Fleming was probably quicker than most of those sorts of bowlers that you're going to go up against as well. That would have been quite interesting. I'm trying to think if there are any others. Because what you're really looking for, I suppose, at that point is you would be... like most South African batters, for instance, would be better against seam bowling, right? And so, and that would be the case of, what we've just said there with Desmond Haynes. I was thinking the same with someone like Matt Hayden, for instance. But then again, if you look at his Shield record, he was pretty good against high quality seam bowling in Australia. as a rule. So yeah, Darren Lehman comes out. I'm trying to think if there was anyone else. I do wonder what it would have been like for, and this is kind of the converse, of course, but someone like Dan Vettori, if he had played more in Asia, what sort of a player Dan Vettori becomes. But if you're looking at someone who would have been worse, okay, what about bowling? Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of players, I suppose, that come from the best teams that, don't have to go up against the best teams, but very few of those best players are not also dominating. Bradman, Sheffield Shield record is extraordinary. It's, when specifically you talk about Bill O'Reilly, who Clara Grimmett's probably maybe the best test bowler of the first part of Bradman's career, and then O'Reilly sort of takes over and becomes the best bowler. And O'Reilly was saying that, Bradman was insane to bowl against. So I don't know. I understand the question, and Lehman, for whatever reason, Lehman really, really instantly springs to mind. But I'm not sure as an overall package how many players I could think of that might have had that as a problem, because I do think it would have to be a player who specifically was very good against a different kind of player. I mean, you could say almost a lot of maybe a lot of the Indian and Sri Lankan spinners might have struggled more. Like, how would Harbhajan have gone even bowling in India against more right-handers? That would be a really, really interesting thing to go against. But my guess is that Harbhajan was such a good bowler in India that would not have been a problem. He probably wouldn't have wanted, maybe some of the Asian spinners specifically would not have wanted to bowl against their own batting lineups away from Asia, where they had that advantage. Even then, I'm not sure that holds up as much as, I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure it holds up as much as you think it would be. But that one might stick in my mind. We'll see if I can come up with something else there. Aditya says, in a discussion with Bharat regarding ODI GOATs, she talked about some players getting labelled as one format batters, even though their record in other formats is equally good. You talked about players like Amla. Do you think Lara fits in that bracket? His ODI record is often overlooked. It's a fairly long career. He averaged 40 with a strike rate of 80, playing in a fairly weak side. So I didn't get to Lara. He was on my list. And what I was going to say about Lara is, I think you can make a fairly good argument that Lara was slightly better, or at least in the same argument as Ricky Ponting when it comes to one-day plays. I think Lara had innings where he was incredible. I never felt that Lara specifically played game after game in the way that Ponting and Tendulkar did. And it felt like they were very professional. They thought about one-day cricket as a far more serious thing than Lara did. And when I looked at him, I felt that. But then on the odd innings, there was, a brilliant innings. I'm trying to remember where it was. I feel like it was somewhere in Australia where he took Australia apart. There was another innings in, there was South Africa in the quarterfinal of the 96. Like, there were innings of Lara's that were just absolutely next level. But I agree with you. As a rule, I think you're right. He is a player that we don't look at in that way. I think for his skill, I believe that just purely on batting talent, he was a better player than Ponting or Tendulkar. But I think that they had the ability to be more consistent and to play to that level. But he had higher peaks. And that's obviously the sort of player he was. We saw that in Test cricket as well. Absolutely incredible from that side of things. So I think from that perspective, yes, I think I do think he was unfairly maligned. Is the other possibility that the West Indies were on the wane during the majority of his career, especially the back half? I would have thought. 92 World Cup, they don't make the semi-finals. 96 World Cup, did they make the semi-finals? 99 World Cup, they don't. They win a Champions Trophy in there somewhere, maybe before it was called a Champions Trophy. And by 2003, they're gone. So I wonder if part of that is just that West Indies are no longer a major part of one-day cricket conversation. Remember, while Brian Lara was in the team, they lost to Kenya in 1996. Things were already a little bit on the slide at that point. Will says, do you know any players intentionally bowling full tosses and hitting the batter around knee high at the death in T20s? They're looking incredibly hard to hit due to the ball coming down towards the batter. When they're bowled accidentally, they mostly go just for one or two. They don't go for one or two. I checked this. I'm pretty sure we cricked this once. The strike rate on full tosses is well over 11 or 12 runs and over, or around, sorry, yeah, 11, between 10 and 12 runs and over. It's not that far off a free hit from memory. That's the low legal full tosses. I think that's right. I think that number holds up. There are certainly players who I remember Lasif Malinga. I think he was going at like 8 runs for his full tosses compared to everyone else. But that's just because of the amount of dip he gets on the ball. So he's more like a baseball pitcher when it comes through. There was a theory, obviously, pre-Dhoni, I suppose, pre-Dilshan and pre-Dhoni, that a low full toss was as good as a Yorker. You remember the commentators used to talk about it all the time. That is the point that they started. I think this comes through Sri Lanka in Indian cricket, that the toe ends of the bats, because the ball stays a little bit lower, were strengthened. Whereas traditionally, especially in South Africa and Australia, that if the ball hit the toe, it wouldn't go anywhere. That has completely changed in modern bats, and a lot of that I would say probably comes from people bowling Yorkers a lot more at the death, and at that stage people didn't have the shots to get up and under the full toss, and it was also before the lap shots. I think from the moment people have started lapping and everything else, and you have players playing their version of the helicopter shot and moving around and being able to get under very low full tosses, I don't think that is the case anymore, Will. I would think that it's probably a fairly bad ball now. But I can't remember the last time I checked it. It was 2 or 3 years ago. I'd be shocked if it's changed, but maybe one for CrickViz than for me. Although, not for Freddie Wild, because he's now the England analyst. So he could probably still answer it, but probably won't. Renee says, with the women's IPL now being the second most expensive cricket league, and also the second most expensive women's sports league, do you see women's cricket spreading the game to different parts of the world better than men's cricket? Definitely. I'm not sure it's the second most expensive cricket league, is it? I would have thought that Major League Cricket would have earned more before even their TV rights, I would think. But I suppose it won't be far off Major League. Anyway, so let's call it second league. Certainly, I was saying with Barrett the other day that I think it would be the second most important sports women's league outside of, women's football in the world. I think it'll beat the WNBA quite comfortably. So do I see? Yeah, I do. I've been saying it for a long time, Renee, that women's cricket is a great way to do this. I mean, the Brazilian model was probably the best model, where they looked at both their teams and went, well, our women are much better than our men. Let's put our money into our women. I do think that associate teams will do that more and more going ahead. I suppose we've seen that at times with American soccer, football, whatever you want to call it. In other cultures, looking at that way, and I think that would certainly happen. Also, Fair Break, as it currently stands, is in a position to make stars out of women from random places in a way that really the men's game is still not ready for, because the women's game is not quite as developed yet and there aren't as many professionals. It means that, I don't know, if you were a really good woman from, Uruguay who happened to be able to hit sixes all the time, learned it on YouTube and just can smack them, it would be not easy, but certainly I could see how teams, if you got into Fair Break and you hit a bunch of sixes, you could probably break into some of the major leagues. And so again, I think there are many different ways that women could make a living off cricket. And certainly from the international point of view, I could see why teams would do that on the lower levels. And then from a league point of view, if this is a big deal, the women's IPL, not just money, but also attention and, moving things forward, if you had young women from around the world, they're going to look at it as a profession, right? And up until recently, you probably only thought about women's cricket if you're a profession, if you were Australian in English. Then obviously the leagues came in and started. I thought, well, if I'm in the best 5 cricketers in my country, I'm a chance of being a league cricketer. That could move further and further very, very quickly. Maynard says, how strict is how strict is copyrighted? How strict is copyrighted content from cricket all around the world? Could we expect a house of highlights for basketball in cricket? Man, I would say that I wouldn't want to say it's the most strict. But it is not far off. I remember every new IPL, there's this great Twitter account that will come up and it'll be going, and this guy you can see he's flicking this finger and blah blah blah, and everyone's like, oh, that's great. And I'm like, yeah, but they're going to take that down, and they usually do. You need multiple accounts of multiple platforms to stay ahead of them. Um, it's really really strict. You have to know the rules, but no one tells you the rules, so you have to know people, and then those people change jobs. And I look, I've written about this a lot before. I think cricket has made a massive error in restricting the amount of footage that you can put up online, especially as a fan, especially if it's educational, especially if it's entertaining. Um, like if I was a cricket board, obviously I don't want 2 hours of highlights going up. But so what the cricket boards will say is, well, we own that and we can't monetize it. Well, I don't agree with that, because if you put it up on YouTube, the way to do it is that if you own that, instead of getting it taken off YouTube, actually what you can do is if I put a video up of, I don't know, Jasprit Brummer bowling 10 Yorkers, right? I can put the video up on my channel, and if I get a sponsor for my channel, I can put the logo there. But if I have ads available that, or if I'm on YouTube, then the person with the copyright should be able to make any money off the Google advertising from that, or turn it off so that you can't advertise it, but you're actually promoting the game for free. Those are all options. There's something like that with the NBA. I don't remember the full detail of it. That's what we should be doing. We should be flooding the market with cricket highlights. I think there's a real reason you see so many clips of the European cricket and club cricket online. It's part of the reason is because if you put actual clips of cricket up, they get taken off. It's so stupid, but I have written about it many times before. Before I was a YouTuber and it mattered to me, because it's so stupid that something happens in baseball or basketball or football, and there's highlights of it everywhere. And in cricket, the only highlights we have are the official thing, and they don't always capture the right thing, and they don't understand the fans' energy, which is why people like Rue Belinda are so huge. We should be encouraging that, not doing the opposite. Oh man, and again, is there any place to watch all cricket matches in their entirety? Do you know what? The ICC Facebook page used to have old games, and they took them down. I don't know of anywhere else. No, I don't know of anywhere else. I certainly haven't found them. So if you find them, Manon, feel free to send them through to me. James says, what are the most aesthetically pleasing grounds you have watched at, and which one would you like to visit? Aesthetically pleasing. Yeah, I kind of like stadiums. So it's probably going to sound weird, but I like Eden Gardens is like one that certainly for me has, I maybe because I grew up in Melbourne, and in Melbourne has so many big stadiums that or that we let one go. became a housing estate. We didn't need the other 80,000 seat stadium. So I grew up there. So I really like stadiums from that perspective. The bigger the better. So Eden Gardens for me is great. Trent Bridge, always had a big affection for Trent Bridge. In fact, if you haven't, we just did a Double Century podcast that came out last week or the week before about the pink polka dots, which is about William Clark, who was a publican who owned the Trent Bridge Inn at the front, if you've ever been to that ground, and just built a cricket ground out the back because he had a franchise team in the 1830s, 1840s. Incredible person, incredible player as well, and built something that has lasted forever in cricket. I love that ground. Something about it. I love the walk to it. I love the vibe at that ground. I can't even tell you what it is that I enjoy about it, but I always have the odd shape. Trying to think of any others that have, like, I have an emotional connection. Oh, P. Sara in Sri Lanka. In fact, I was looking through a bunch of photos of my career the other day. I've released my sports writing course, of which hopefully we'll remember to put a link in here. But it's, if you put in fans with laptops and you want to do that course, we've now put all the multimedia stuff up. But we're doing a video about it, and I had to find all the things. And at Pete Sara, they have a chalkboard with the DRS, how many reviews. And I love that they were actually mapping the technology of cricket with a chalkboard. It's almost like a club ground, but I absolutely loved everything about it. It really felt incredible for me to go back to. To go to to go from an international ground to that. In fact, the ground at Kandy is great, sort of in a basin. Obviously, Cape Town is something. Although people don't talk about this, but sometimes Cape Town stinks because of the brewing of the beer smell. Trying to think of any others I've been to that I really enjoyed. From that, obviously Darren Mashala is incredible, the background, but also the way that you get to the ground, the walk around it and everything else. I'm kind of a walk to it person as much as anything else. I'm trying to think if there's any others that stand out to me. Yeah, I think those are the ones off the top of my head. That I really really like. I'm trying to think if there's a West Indies one. Oh, again, and this is like not going to be for everyone, but there's something about the St Kitts and Nevis ground and the Guyana ground, in fact, that I just really liked. They just felt like they were organic, I suppose is the word. And perhaps there's something to the fact that I like those sorts of grounds. But yeah, certainly that is one that those are two that I really enjoy. But also the crowds and the way that the crowds specifically support their teams. Cameron says, is there any evidence to support the idea of sledging and getting into the batter's head? No, there's no evidence. I mean, I'd be shocked if it didn't work on certain occasions, but I'd also be shocked if on many different occasions it did the exact opposite. There are players you do not want to sledge, in any sport or have banter with. And I think there is a man called Ruffy. Lost his email. He emailed me the other day, though. I'll give him a plug. I don't think his book's out yet. Ruffy Cohan, American writer who contacted me about sledging and cricket. He was doing something about trash talk, and I think specifically probably basketball is maybe one of the most famous. And then obviously someone along the line said to him, "If you think basketball's bad, wait till you come across cricket." And you did a lot on Australian sledging. I haven't read the chapter, so I'm not sure exactly where he is with that. But yeah, if you told me it affected players overall, I would say that some players would probably be affected by it negatively, and some players would be affected by it positively, and many it wouldn't affect at all. But I don't know if there's a way, Cameron, to even work that out. Renee says, should the IPL have a promotion relegation system once it eventually becomes too big? And look, it's never going to. I think it's more aimed on the American model. And the American model is partly they are buying into the fact that they are never going to be relegated. I mean, if you ask me, I think promotion and relegation is a better system than, what's happened with the Sacramento Kings in basketball, although they're having a very good year. Light up that beam. But, Indiana Pacers and Sacramento Kings, they're kind of stuck in this middle period that they never have to worry about. That's why I love promotion and relegation. But I don't think the IPL is ever going to be that league. I don't think we'll see that because most of these leagues need buy-in from the owners to begin with. And so why would you buy into a league where you could end up being in the B League? I personally wouldn't do that. So I can see why that probably won't ever happen. Ian says, great crossover episode with Dan on fairness. Totally agree that cricket isn't at all fair and all the better and more quirky for it. As regards to Pollard, etc., and running one short to keep the strike, though, how short can you be? Am I right that the umpire has the ability to disallow both runs if he believes that it to be deliberate? He does now, Ian. That comes from Kieron Pollard doing that. He wasn't the first player to do it. So for those, I'll try and explain it. Imagine Kieron Pollard is batting with a tail ender, and he has towed the ball out to long off, and he realizes that he's only going to be able to get one for it. What Kieron Pollard was doing is, instead of going all the way to the end and trying to steal two, he was actually crossing with the batter, coming up about 2 meters short, and then sprinting back to the other end. That was an obvious flaw in the game, and clearly the umpire would call one short. Do that on my other shoulder. Clearly the umpire would call one short, but the problem being there is that you're calling one short, but all Pollard really wanted to do was make sure he got one run from the ball and got the strike back. And so that was very much going to be done. David Hooks is the oldest story I know of that happening, but I'm sure that it happened earlier in cricket as well, where players worked out that loophole in the laws, and it, it's weird that the MCC hadn't cracked down on that, but maybe it just hadn't happened enough. Christopher says the T20 domestic league sometimes not get the coverage it needs to do from journalists because their preference will often be for Test cricket and internationals. I listen to a few podcasts and the coverage is often very good, but I get less insight for the leagues and international game. You still get paid a lot more money to cover international cricket. That's one reason. It's much harder to cover the league cricket. Usually it's more junior journalists. I do think there is a part of it that is the international side of it. But not the international side of it, the more prestige. But there really isn't a lot of money in covering those leagues at the moment. The best way to see this is you don't see a lot of journalists jumping from league to league to league. I can't think of anyone who does that regularly. I think that's what someone like Freddie Wild probably wanted early in his career, and he couldn't really make that work. I certainly could never make that work. I had this vision of, being able to go to the Big Bash, the PSL, and then the IPL instead of international cricket. I've just never been. In fact, I've very rarely ever been paid to write about league cricket, and I've worked in leagues. So I do think there's a market inefficiency there, and I wonder when that switches over. The other thing I would say is just because the way that T20 cricket works, I think there's too much, disposable is the wrong word, but I think there's too often in T20 cricket where fans are not trained to follow the entire league. They kind of watch the game and disappear, and watch the game and disappear. I think fantasy cricket fans are probably slightly different, and there's obviously a few hardcore T20 fans out there. But as a overall thing, going, 2 nights back, this happened, I'm not sure that T20 fans are trained in that way to consume their cricket that way yet. And that's also because of the things you've talked about. Certainly newspapers would say to you that they don't get many reads. There are certain places that have done very well with getting T20 coverage, and even they don't usually get big sponsors from it. So it's a tricky position that it's in at the moment, but I definitely agree with you that the coverage of it is nowhere near. It frustrates the hell out of me how little coverage there is of the major T20 leagues, and actually maybe more so the minor ones. I'm going to go and have a look at a few questions for you, but first let us play and while I do that, I should say, let me play an ad, and I'll go through it and see if there's any more questions that I can answer in the chat. There is something wrong in the cricket world, and while it may not be a conspiracy, there does seem to be a movement towards leaving more grass on the wicket, and thusly, the global batting average has dropped. If a similar thing has happened to you in your personal life, try Manscaped. Their Lawnmower 4.0 will help you trim any unwanted pubic grass. And once your downstairs track is taken care of, you can also use Manscaped's liquid formulations. So before heading outside, use the Crop Preserver ball deodorant to stay cool in the heat. And if you've been playing too many games recently and you need some help with your strip, why don't you go and get their Crop Reviver? I think I may possibly have taken all of this analogy too far. But the point is, Manscaped sells items that allow you to shave your pubic itch pitch. Use the code REDINKER, all one word, which is the name of my podcast, and you can get a 20% discount and free worldwide shipping while you curate your special strip like a team of sweaty men hoping it doesn't rain. All right, well, with that image, if you're watching the YouTube, thank you to Muku for that ad. I will make some new ones, completely my fault. Or actually, probably blame Muku as well, but it's probably my fault. But yeah, some questions. There's a couple of super chats, of course, which now I can't tell which ones are the super chats because they all come up the same. Oh, no, here it is. Dovetail. So if you do want your question 100% answered because it's so important, then you have that option. Dovetail says, how much of an advantage is it for a great player on a good team compared to a great player in a bad or weak team? I suppose it depends on what kind of player you are and what kind of weakness that team has. One of the good ones is Bert. Oh, no, it's not Bert Sutcliffe. Why have I forgotten? John Reid from New Zealand. If you talk to players of that era, they really talk up John Reid. I think he might have even captained an international 11 at one stage, or certainly was he was thought to be one of the best players in the world. And you look at his record, and you would look at it and go, "What?" And I think in John Reed's case, he probably would have been an ideal player to. I'm trying to think of the sort of player he would have been to bat at maybe number 6 in a sort of Botham style. I think he was probably a better bat than Botham, but in that kind of attacking number 6 role behind a strong team, and he bats as high as 4, I think, maybe even 3 at times, and he did that behind no openers. So he's batting at number 4, number 5. I think John Reed never won a Test match. I think that's right. Might have been Bert Sutcliffe. One of them didn't anyway. But let's say you're John Reed and you're supposed to be batting at number 6, and that would be your best spot in a really good team. You're now batting at number 4, and your team doesn't have a very good 1, 2, or 3. So you're going to be in even earlier. In that case, John Reed's overall average has to be affected by that. And how often can he come in and smack the ball hard like he wants to? Playing out of position and then playing out of role definition. So I do think you get players like that. That is probably more for the players who are just beneath that sort of GOAT level. I think if you're a GOAT level player, I shouldn't say that, but you put it. Did you put GOAT? No, I just made it up. That was even worse. Sorry, Dufter. But if you're that sort of great level player, so like Andy Flower, probably in a really good team, maybe still you want to bat him at 5 or 6, but Andy Flower, obviously good enough to bat 3 or 4 as well. Good enough's the wrong way. His skills were diverse enough to be able to bat at 3 or 4 or 5, 6, 7. In a way that Bracewell wasn't. So I don't think it affects Andy Flower as much. And you can see that from his record. If you're a bowler, you can argue in some ways, if you're a great bowler, and again, if we're talking about great players here, you're probably going to end up with a fantastic record when it comes to percentage of wickets. So Fazal Mahmood, Richard Hadley, Murali, all great bowlers, right? But their numbers look a lot better than Joel Garner's numbers do, or that Shane Warne's do, because they had the ability to take so many 5-wicket hauls and probably cash in. And you've got every time you've got to take a wicket, they go in. That's so in that way, maybe they're probably getting extra wickets per game than you wouldn't be. But I do think there are situations when being a great player on a good team is a hindrance, or being a great player on a good team maybe is not a hindrance, but your skills maybe don't shine as bright as they would. Like if, I don't know, Jason Gillespie is an Australian great player. He's not an all-time great, probably because of what happened at the end of his career, but he was certainly, one of the best bowlers that Australia's ever had. But he was also the 3rd best bowler in that team. He might have at times been fighting to be the number 1 best bowler in that team, but he's never going to be remembered that way. So you slip down automatically, I think, in the way that you are seen. But having said that, it would be really interesting to see how good Jason Gillespie would have been if he had been the number 1 bowler on that team, rather than the 3rd best bowler. Whereas, if you swap him and Joel Garner, my guess is that if Jason Gillespie is playing for the West Indies team, actually, maybe that doesn't work. I'm trying to think. So Joel Garner is a great player on a great team. And again, he's actually very similar to Gillespie. So I'm trying to think of another player who maybe, who gets a ride because of it. Because that's what you're really looking at, a player who maybe wouldn't have been that good. Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. You talk about Lara and Sachin in the 90s. But yeah, I think from that perspective, you'd probably rather be that. I think if you're a bowler, it probably, and you're a great bowler, probably doesn't matter as much because you're getting individual wickets. That's not to say that you can't get pressure from the other end, but there's other ways of pressuring from the other end, as Richard Hadley's teammates and Murali's teammates certainly still helped their bowling. Whereas batting, I think if you look at Lara, maybe more so because of the kind of pitches he played on, how often was Lara in too early, when that's really not when you want Lara to be in, compared to if he played with great openers in front of him for an extended period. You'd think there would have been an impact there. Dovetail asked another one. Why didn't Ireland and Scotland develop into cricket nation as compared to Asian countries? As they had more opportunity to play against England, and I believe they had access to English domestic cricket. Part of the reason is because they were sort of folded into English cricket at a time. Douglas Jardine is Scottish, right? And Ian Peebles is Scottish. So they had very, very good players who wouldn't even go on to play for Scotland. So that was one of Scotland's bigger problems. In Scotland specifically, well, the other thing you need to know about that, Scotland and Ireland, they're almost two different situations. In Scotland, my understanding of it is that cricket was very much a sport played by people from elite backgrounds, which is not the overall population. And then you have a small population to begin with, so you're not picking from the entire country already. And a lot of that was probably anti-English sentiment, would be my guess. In Ireland, they had a rule against cricket by the GAA, which is the Gaelic Athletic Association, I think, if I'm remembering all my details, Dovetail, off the top of my head, which made it very hard for you to play cricket and, well, no, actually, it made it impossible for you to play cricket and one of the Gaelic sports, which is Gaelic football, and the other one's the one with the sticks. And there's probably two others that I've forgotten. I think there's like four of them, isn't there? And then also the anti-English sentiment, again, was a big, big deal there. There was a period where a lot of Irish cricketers felt uncomfortable with that. But remember, Ireland were really good at cricket and had a lot of very good players. And my guess is that Scotland did as well. But I do think being involved with England also made it a bit of a problem because your best players would disappear. And then a lot of the best Irish players, probably Alec O'Riordan, there's a lot of really good players that they produced, didn't get county contracts, so they probably didn't develop the way they should have. Whereas maybe towards the 70s and 80s, you start to see a couple of Ireland players come in. And obviously, Ed Joyce sort of starts a revolution, really, in that way. So there's a big development. I played club cricket with Ed Joyce when he was 18, 19, I want to say. At that stage, I don't think he played county cricket. Watching Ed Joyce play at that stage, and if he'd never played county cricket, I don't think he would have been anywhere near the player he was. He was not much better than, I mean, he didn't make any runs in Australian club cricket as a guy who was, as I said, 18, 19 years old. I bowled to him quite a lot, and I've bowled to a lot of first-class players and a lot of very good club players. He's not on my list of the hardest people I had to bowl to, and he's a left-hander. He did smack me a few times, but not in the way that you would expect a player of that quality to get on top of me. So I certainly think from that perspective, I think they had the talented players and they weren't developing. The other thing I would say is that cricket didn't develop in the same way as it did in Asia, as it did in those two countries. And the other thing I would mention is weather, which I don't think we can ever completely. It's very wet in Scotland, pretty wet in Ireland too. Greeny says, would you agree that subcontinent cricket culture is a tad polarizing and in your face? They take everything too seriously and can't handle classic banter. Well, I mean, most banter is just someone being an arsehole, if we're being honest, Greeny. I've said for a long time that West Indies fans are the most passionate, the most angry, the most harsh on their players, but there's no one there. There's no one in the islands. I think one of the reasons, especially that Indian fans seem more polarizing in your face is because there's 1.3 or 1.4 billion Indian people. I would say that also we're living in this era now where the Indian men's cricket team is still, one of the biggest things in India. That, the Sri Lankan men's cricket team is the same, the Pakistan men's cricket team, Bangladesh men's cricket team, not so much the women, although they're on their rise as well. And so there was a time, have a look at how Australia handled Bodyline. So there was certainly a time when we saw similar things like that happen in other cricket cultures. But, the Australian men's team just isn't as important into regular Australian culture as some of these teams are to the Asian parts thing. I don't expect that to be the case forever. And there was a time when, the New Zealand men's team was incredibly important to New Zealand culture. That's certainly not the case anymore. So things change. And just had a dropout. I don't know if anyone can hear me. What is going on? Sorry about that, everyone. My internet seems to have crashed. I'm on Ethernet, so I'm not really sure how that has happened. But yeah, so from that perspective, look, I just think it has a different part. But I think that's how England people thought about Australians quite a while ago. And I'm guessing, Greeny, that you are an Australian. So kind of tells you how these things change. And at different times, your team is going to be more important. Carl says, never understood why the BCCI doesn't allow Indian players to play in T20 leagues abroad. Surely players who aren't in the national team could use the experience and pay. Yes. I mean, obviously, it's an IPL thing about making more money, but it doesn't really it doesn't really make a lot of sense from a talent development standpoint. And, you know, there's a lot of talk in the IPL about how they want to make India the best team in the world. Not allowing your players to play in other leagues would seem to be, at the moment, not helping with that aim. And, you know, we're certainly seeing West Indies and now England using the other leagues to your advantage. And I've talked about it before in one of my videos on, you know, why India struggle in World Cups. There's ways of doing it that are different than what happened with the West Indies, and also different to even how England are doing it. I believe in the future there will be people who work at boards whose job it is to get players into different leagues. I'm available for that position, by the way. Mahedi-san, Shanaka, and Bracewell, why Indian bowlers give up when someone is attacking, and what's the solution to that? That's cricket. They don't give up. They probably run out of options. It's just a thing that happens. Yeah, they don't give up. If you're thinking there are players out there giving up, players are the most competitive people that you will meet. In conversation, they're competitive. This whole idea that, you know, you see them bowling bad and you think they've given up. We've got to start thinking that's not how things are. They might have run out of ideas. They may not be on a good pitch. They may not be in a situation that's using the best of their advantage. But they, as far as I've seen, they do not give up. And that's players of any country. They might get tired. They might not be fit enough. Asjad says, what is the revenue model for the UAE T10? I don't know. I don't know the revenue models for a lot of these leagues. I know that they sell their betting rights, so I don't know if it's something to do with that. I don't know how much money they need to sustain from what I would think to be very low TV rights, if that's enough to make it. There's a lot of leagues in T20 cricket and T10 cricket where I do not understand how they exist and how they continue to exist. I think in some, one thing I would say is I think in some cases it is a long-term play. You're not really supposed to make money on the first 2, 3, 4 years. It really is, you know, developing your product. If you get to the 4 or 5 year mark, you should be able to kick on. Although we have seen leagues like CPL struggle to do that. What else have we got here? Jay says, Hasaranga hasn't been effective in ODIs compared to T20s, especially in away games where he averages 80 with the ball in 14 innings. Is the lack of good leg break top spinner a problem? I think that he is very well set up for when people come at him very hard. You know, it's a different kind of one-day bowling is a different kind of bowling than T20 bowling. If players aren't coming at you as hard, they can probably milk you a lot more. And perhaps it is, you know, if you think about what he's doing in T20 cricket, it's very subtle and it's very T20 orientated. He's bowling with a low arm action, trying to hit the top of off stump or trying to hit the top of leg stump. In one-day cricket, you can milk and move him around. Whereas T20 cricket, you're trying to hit out, and eventually he's going to slide one through you, one way or the other, and dismiss you. That's not the case in one-day cricket. And I think some bowlers will have the skill set to be able to bowl both naturally, and some won't. Like, I'm not sure Samuel Badgery would have been a great one-day bowler. I hope he doesn't have a great one-day record. I've forgotten it, but my memory is he doesn't. Arnav says, why do you think RCB have done so bad in the IPL considering their star lineups? I think their star lineups is part of the problem. I think they got obsessed with star culture rather than actually trying to fit a good team together. I think they had a very bad ownership structure to begin with. I was briefly involved with their second ownership structure. I thought that was a bit of a madhouse as well, though a lot better than the first one was. I think they tried to make I think at one stage they were trying to make very sound data-led decisions, and then on one side of the business and on the other side of the business, they were going with what Virat said or who Virat trusted, and I think those two things were very much at ends with each other. I don't think Virat ever had the time to fully develop into. I just don't think he was thinking about each individual game the way that he should have been. From my understanding of what happened there, being very, very tangentially involved in them. And I also don't think that he thought about T20 cricket in the way that perhaps it needed to be thought about. But I really do think a lot of it was star players and not thinking about role players. And the other one was, it's very rare that I've looked at their bowling lineup and thought that is a solid bowling lineup all the way through, which is obviously another issue. But they probably, because it's been so long, they probably had many different issues over the times. Shamama says, if you're aware of the history of that region, Shakib and Litton being the only Bengals in the team, what do you think the importance of that is to KKR fans? I think it's interesting from a cricket perspective that they're Bangladeshis. Litton's overall record, I'm not saying he was picked solely because of that, because I think that innings against India certainly played a part. But it'd be interesting if that is something in the marketing that is quite important. But I also think, if you're really going to develop this into a proper league, and we're still a way away from that. It's still quite a short pop-up kind of league. But if it's really going to develop into, quite a great league, then, and eventually they will get rid of overseas restrictions. I think it has to mature beyond, you want the local boys playing. It's always great. It doesn't matter what league you're watching in the world. It's great when a local boy does well for a team. But I think we know now enough about sports that that's not necessarily why people tune in. And I think as this league matures, that will mean less. It would be interesting to know if Litton went there specifically, though. Not specifically, but at least in any part because of his background. 42 to Jat 42 says, given how popular they are, when is 99.94 setting up its T20 league? We won't be setting up our own league, but we will be trying to cover them in the future, if that's what you mean. But we're still a ways off that. We haven't done all the international teams. We could have very easily started by covering county cricket or the IPL. It just happened to be that when we were starting the business, the World Cup was coming. So we went with that. But it wasn't, it wasn't us slamming the leagues. As I said, I would have happily started with county cricket. The business model works for anything in that way. I think I have done everything else. I'll just finish up with this one from Max because it's interesting to me. What's with WA and batting all-rounders? Marsh, Stoinis, Cartwright, Cam Green, and now Hardy. You can go back to Tom Moody, probably John M. Verrerity. Who else am I missing? Brad Hogg batted at 6 in a star-studded Western Australian lineup when he started as well. If you also want wicket keepers, they've had Luke Ronke and Ryan Campbell. Obviously, Adam Gilchrist came from somewhere else. Yeah, it's interesting. I can't think of anything specific. With the West, when South Africa, someone asked a similar question with South Africa once, and I wondered if it was a situation where their coaching is so good and precise that even when you're a natural bowling talent, I look at Rabada. Rabada clearly is not a great bat, but he still has a very, very good technique compared to most tail-enders. I wonder if there is something within the way that cricketers are produced in South Africa, if even their bowlers end up with fairly good batting training. I mean, even Morne Morkel had a decent technique. Couldn't bat, but so I wonder if a similar thing has happened in Western Australia, where there's a reason for that. I can't think of any reason why that should be the case, though. It could just be dumb luck. But, going to, from John M. Verrerity all the way through to who's the most recent? Who do you have? Hardy? It certainly seems to be a pattern there that you don't see really strongly in other Australian cricket cultures. I can't think of a reason off the top of my head, but great question. Great questions, everyone. Really enjoyed the chat. Thank you to everyone. Sorry about that drop off. I think my Ethernet's gone to hell. But thank you to everyone who asked questions. If you're interested in the sports writing course, as I said, Google Fans with Laptop, Jarrod Kimber. You can see it. And I will talk to you again soon. Oh, thanks to Bodyline T-shirts as well. This is my favorite body. Oh, I can't even show it because of the microphone. But this is WG Grace in a pedalo. One of the few cricket T-shirts that I am wearing to wear outside of a cricket environment. Just because of how much I love the design of it, and how there's like about 12 people in the world who will get that joke. And I enjoy it even more because of that. Anyway, thank you for coming on. Remember, you can listen to this on the normal podcast feed. If you want ad-free, you can sign up to our Patreon. But you can also listen to this podcast on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter now. And thank you to everyone. But subscribe, retweet, share, tell everyone. And we'll be back again next week. Goodbye.